Okay, so today we're going to be talking about British imperialism in India. And see a picture here in the background that does kind of sum up the British experience in India, where the Indians were treated as servants to the British society that lived there. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So first, here is a picture of the British Empire at its height and all of the territories that Britain did control. This would be in the kind of late 1700s all the way through to the mid 1800s. So, for example, Britain loses the territories kind of in the western continental United States, but gains territories like India and Australia and much of this African continent in the 1800s. So this is at one time or another the land that Britain controlled in an imperial way. So the saying is that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they did span the globe from one end to the other. Colonies around the world, but of all of their colonies, India was the most important colony. And here is India. This is a British man kind of wringing the money out of India. And that is why it was so important, called the jewel in the crown. If you imagine a crown, often kind of that middle jewel will be the biggest. And it's called the crown jewel because it is the highlight or the focus point of the crown. And so of all of the colonies that Britain had, India was the jewel in the crown because it was the biggest and the most important and the focus point of British imperialism. So it starts with what's called the East India Company. Now, the East India Company was a British company that was established in the area of India for trade. And this was done in the 1600s. At the time, the Mughal Empire dominated the area. This was a Muslim empire that ruled in India and Afghanistan and other parts of the East. And so this was just a small, relatively small trading company owned by the British. What happened was that over time, the Mughal Empire began to decline. And what you ended up with was an opportunity that the British seized on to begin to battle and defeat the Indians for control as the Mughal Empire did decline. States began to break away from that empire, and through the different kind of battles that Britain was able to have against the new territories, and another tactic which included replacing the Indian aristocracy or the princes that existed in different regions, replacing them with British officials was another way that Britain gained territory. And then finally, the third way, so between battles, replacing the Indian aristocracy with British officials, and third, the British prohibited Hindu rulers that did not have a natural heir from adopting an adoptive heir or a successor. And so after that ruler died, the British would annex the territory that prince had ruled over. So what happens as the Mughal Empire declines, the British step in and they begin to usurp the power in a variety of ways. So from that point forward, as the British East India Company has gained control, they begin to run the country of India, or the territory rather of India, without interference from Britain. They established their own army, and that army was led by British officers, and then they recruited Indian soldiers that were called sepoys. The military itself was to the tune of about 300,000 military men, 50,000 of whom were British and 250,000 of whom were Indian. So it was a much more significant Indian population in the army. And the British tried to force changes on India, and this did not sit well with the local population. There was an increasing pace of westernization, and that meant that the Hindu society, which was the dominant society of the Indian people, was being affected by the introduction of these Western ideas. Now, kind of maybe most obviously were the missionaries that were sent into India, and they challenged the religious beliefs of the Hindus. But there were also humanitarian movements or efforts toward emancipating women, for instance, and education as well. For instance, there was an effort to end the caste system, which was the class system, caste and class system in India, giving women more rights, emancipating them, removing legal obstacles that prevented Hindu women from remarrying. It banned the Hindu custom of sati, which was when the widow of a Hindu man had to throw herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. So her husband's body would be set on fire and he would be cremated, and the widow, under this Hindu custom of sati, would throw herself onto the fire and essentially commit suicide and die with her husband. The British put an end to that custom. Here's an example there. And they're, of course, spreading Christian belief, which challenges the Hindu belief. So there was a widespread belief that the British were trying to break down the caste system and introduce the Western methods of education, which was a direct challenge to the orthodoxy that was provided by both the Hindus and the Muslims. So as the Indians see this attack on Hinduism and their culture spreading and going on for longer periods of time, they begin to mutiny or rebel. So the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion is this episode when in 1857, British officers got angry that some of the sepoys or the Indian soldiers in their military stopped following orders. And this came about because the weapons, the introduction of this new rifle at the time required that the soldier actually bite off the tip of the cartridge. And so you see here are pictures of the cartridges. And a rumor spread that these cartridges were covered in pork and beef fat. And both of these are offensive to the local populations, which was either Hindu, which we've talked about, or Muslim. The Mughal Empire was a Muslim empire. So these animals are sacred and dirty. So sacred, the beef is sacred in India, and pigs are dirty to Muslims. They cannot have them. And so you have this cartridge, rumor that they were covered in this animal fat, and the soldiers, either Hindu or Muslim, refused to bite the cartridge in order to load the weapon, because that would be against their religious belief. So an officer, a sepoy, in March of 1857, attacks British officers at a military garrison, and he's arrested and he's executed by the British in early April. So later in April, the sepoys in other areas refuse to deal with the cartridges themselves, and so they are actually brought up on trial by the British officers, and they're imprisoned. So here you see a picture of the new rifle, the Enfield rifle, and you can see the cartridge that they would have to bite this end off. They then would pour the gunpowder into the weapon. They would then put the bullet in the weapon as well, still wrapped in the paper, and then use what's called the ramrod, actually, to push the bullet down into the rifle so that it could be fired. So this is the piece here, the biting of the cartridge that they were fighting against. So the British officers are angry. They demand that the sepoys follow the rules, and that goes against the sepoys' religious beliefs, so they don't. And So you get this revolt that spreads because the British officers do not respond well. The British officers, as I mentioned a moment ago, jail the sepoys. Other sepoys stand up in solidarity with the jailed sepoys, and they begin this rebellion. So during the rebellion itself, there were atrocities committed by both sides. The mutineers, the sepoys, very commonly shot their British officers on rising. They were responsible for massacres in some major cities like Delhi and Kanpur and elsewhere. They murdered women and children, and this enraged the British. And so the British responded with even worse forms of vengeance. So sepoys were bayoneted, or they were actually fired from cannons in a frenzy of this British kind of revenge. Some British officers did protest the bloodshed, but it's safe to say that, as it says here, atrocities were committed on both sides during the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion. So in 1858, the British are able to crush the rebellion. They bring in some British military officials from England, and they put down the Sepoy Rebellion in India. Here are some pictures from that. And so what you see are the cannons, and you see the sepoys in front of the cannons. And so these cannons are fired, and the sepoys are standing in front of them, and they'll be killed in that way. Another example was the firing squad. And so these men have been lined up, and you see these are the mutineers, the sepoys, and this is the firing squad, and they're going to execute these. This is actually called the moment of death for the mountaineers. This is the firing squad carrying out the execution. So there were many impacts of the Sepoy Mutiny, and that's what we're going to talk about now. First, because of the atrocities committed by both sides, feelings of distrust between the Indians and the British emerged. The Indians did not feel like they were valued by the British. The British did not trust that the sepoys would not rise up in rebellion again. And so you end up with both sides feeling that they cannot trust the other. You also have Britain, because they feel like they cannot trust the local sepoys, so the local military, or the East India Company anymore. The Sepoy Rebellion shows that the East India Company was unable to control the area. The British ended the rule of the East India Company in India, and they began an episode of direct rule over India. This period of Britain's direct rule of India is called the Raj, R-A-J. So the British Raj, it's the direct rule in India. The picture of many more British people coming into India and settling there permanently. You have many more government officials as well. And you have now the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, becomes the Empress of India as well. So she holds many titles. The Indian Civil Service was created. This is a government agency that carried the British administration of India. So no more East India Company. Instead, it is now the Indian Civil Service. So there's a general house cleaning then of Indian administration. The financial crisis that was caused by the mutiny also led to a reorganization of India's finances. The Indian Army was extensively reorganized as well. And maybe more importantly, there was the beginning of a policy that the Indian population would be consulted on issues from this point forward. Up until 1853, in fact, the ruling class in India had been formed solely of Europeans, and they were behaving as if they were a full-fledged parliament representing all of the people in India, when in fact there was no local or native representation in this quote unquote Indian parliament. So from this point forward, the local population was consulted. In addition, educational and public works programs like the building of railroads and telegraphs and roads and irrigation canals continued with little interruption. And some actually were even speeded up as railroads and roads and bridges. The construction of those in some instances were increased because the English realized that they might need to move soldiers quickly in case of an additional rebellion. And so they built railroads at a faster rate than they had before so that they could use them to their advantage in the event of another military conquest. So let's see. This leads to the idea that the Indian nationalism, where the Indian population begins to really seek independence from the British because they feel like their culture has been superseded by an English culture. The Indians are not feeling respected. As you see in this picture, they are forced into the low-paying jobs. They have very little political power, as we've just talked about, and they are just feeling like they've been left out of the administration of their own country. And so they desire self-rule. So this rise of nationalism in India is created from the the early 1800s on. And here are some of the reasons that I've just discussed. So they want more say in their government. They're barred from political jobs. They're paid less than the British workers. And the Indians felt that they're being treated as second-class citizens in their own country. So this man, Ram Mohan Roy, believed that Indians had to change in order to be free from Western control. And he said that the present system of the Hindus was not well calculated to promote their political interests. And some change needs to take place in their religion, at least for the sake of political advantage. So he's a reformer, he's an educational. He says we need to change some of our traditional practices like the sati and the rigid class structure and the arranged marriages. And essentially, he promoted progressive change to the traditional customs of the religion. He called for India to modernize and westernize to become more like English culture, but not to leave everything behind. So from this Indian nationalism come two organizations, the Indian National Congress, which is Hindu, and the Muslim League, which is your Muslim contingent. Both of these groups sought more independence, self-rule from England, and they became leaders of the Indian independence movement that later Gandhi kind of takes the helm of, and India does finally achieve their independence in 1947. Here's some information about the Indian National Congress. And the Muslim League. So because of British imperialism in India, there were a number of positive outcomes. First, the new roads and the railroads linked India. India ended up with the third largest railway network in the world as a result of the British construction of that. The telegraph and postal systems united people in India. Again, they had a very advanced telegraph and mail system. They had irrigation systems to improve their farming. The construction of canals helped Indian farmers. New laws promoted justice for all people as the English eliminated as much as they could the caste system and challenged some of the religious beliefs, which emancipated women and allowed them more opportunity to participate in society. There was an exposure to Western education. Literacy did explode. Sanitation also was improved, and customs that threatened human rights were ended. But as with all imperial practice, there were negatives as well. Indian resources were removed from India and sent to Britain for the benefit of Britain and Britain alone. Indians were forced to buy British-made goods instead of their locally made products. The British goods at times were more expensive than the locally made products, and still the Indians were forced to buy these things from the Indians were forced to buy these things from the British. Farms were growing cash crops rather than food crops. This meant that the farmers in India were growing crops that could be easily sold for a profit rather than food for themselves. So they are dependent on imports for food because they're not growing the food locally. Indians were treated as inferior or as second-class citizens, and the British did attempt to replace Indian culture with Western culture whenever possible. So good and bad for the people of India, and that concludes our study of imperialism in India.